The winter of 1886 settled over the Wyoming Territory with a patience that only the frontier understood. It didn't arrive all at once. It crept over the hills day by day, coating the pines with frost and turning the winding trails into frozen ribbons. Folks who had spent their lives in the territory never relied on weather predictions. They watched the sky, listened to the wind through the cottonwoods, and paid attention to the uneasy silence that always came before a great storm. Margaret Hale knew those signs better than most. At 39 years old, she had spent nearly half her life working the Hale Creek Ranch, a spread of rolling pastureland tucked against the foothills outside the small settlement of Red Pine Valley. The ranch had once belonged to her husband, William, but after illness claimed him 5 winters earlier, every fence, every horse, every calf, and every ledger book became her responsibility. Most people had expected her to sell. She never did. Instead, she worked harder than anyone expected a woman to work. By sunrise, she was already feeding horses. By noon, she was repairing broken gates. By evening, she balanced ranch accounts beside the fireplace while supper simmered over the stove. People admired her determination, but very few knew the loneliness that waited inside the old ranch house after dark. The silence had become part of her life. At first, it had felt unbearable. Then it became familiar. Eventually, it became home. That Thursday afternoon, the horses grew restless long before the clouds gathered. Margaret noticed them lifting their heads toward the western hills. The cattle drifted together instead of spreading across the pasture. Even the ranch dog refused to wander far from the porch. She looked toward the mountains. Dark clouds rolled over the peaks like waves swallowing the sky. "We've got company," she murmured. She hurried through her chores, stacking extra firewood beside the kitchen door, filling water buckets before they froze solid, and making certain every barn latch was secure. By sunset, the wind howled across the valley. Snow no longer drifted gently. It attacked. Sharp flakes raced sideways through the air, erasing the trail leading to town within minutes. No sensible traveler would be outside tonight. Margaret locked the front door and added another log to the fire. She poured herself a cup of coffee and settled into the rocking chair beside the hearth with an old history book she had read countless times. Outside, the blizzard roared louder. Inside, the only sounds were crackling firewood and the ticking clock above the mantel. Then came 3 heavy knocks. She froze. Nobody visited Hale Creek Ranch after dark. Certainly not during a storm like this. The knocking came again. Louder. Urgent. Margaret grabbed the oil lantern hanging beside the door. With one hand resting on the old revolver kept near the entrance, she slowly opened it. The icy wind burst inside. Standing on the porch was a young man buried beneath layers of snow. His hat had nearly disappeared beneath ice. His beard was white with frost. One arm hung awkwardly against his side. The other clutched the porch railing as though letting go would send him collapsing into the storm. His lips trembled as he spoke. "Ma'am." His voice was steady. His body wasn't. "My horse fell, South Canyon." Margaret studied him carefully. He couldn't have been older than 30. His face showed exhaustion rather than fear. He had walked a long distance to reach the ranch. Behind him there was nothing except swirling white darkness. If she turned him away, he would never survive the night. She stepped aside. "Come inside before you freeze to death." The young man nodded gratefully. "Thank you." He staggered over the threshold. The warmth hit him immediately. Snow melted from his coat onto the wooden floor as he struggled to remain standing. Margaret shut the door against the wind and hung the lantern nearby. "Sit down." He obeyed without argument, lowering himself carefully into the nearest chair. Only then did she notice the unnatural angle of his shoulder. She knelt beside him. "How long has it been like this?" "Since early afternoon." "You've been walking with a dislocated shoulder?" "I didn't have much choice." She almost smiled despite herself. "You've got more determination than good sense." "I've been told that before." She examined the injury with practiced hands. Living alone on a ranch meant learning things doctors normally handled. She had treated broken ribs, stitched deep cuts, and even set a broken ankle years before. A dislocated shoulder wasn't beyond her abilities. She looked into his tired eyes. "This is going to hurt." He gave a faint laugh. I figured as much. Ready as I'll ever be. Without hesitation, she pulled firmly while rotating his arm. A sharp pop echoed through the quiet room. The young man's jaw tightened. His fingers dug into the chair. But he never cried out. When it was over, he leaned forward, breathing slowly until the pain eased. Margaret wrapped the shoulder tightly with clean cloth before placing a warm blanket around him. There. He flexed his fingers carefully. Already feels better. It won't tomorrow. She moved toward the stove and placed a kettle over the fire. What brings you through Wyoming in the middle of winter? He hesitated before answering. My name's Samuel Brooks. She nodded. Margaret Hale. I was heading west looking for work. Heard there were ranches hiring near Jackson. Took the canyon trail to save time. You nearly lost your life saving time. I suppose I did. She poured 2 steaming cups of coffee. Samuel accepted his with both hands, letting the warmth seep into his frozen fingers. After several quiet moments, Margaret finally asked, How far did you walk? He stared into the fire. 5 miles, maybe 6. She looked at the snow still melting beneath his boots and silently calculated the odds. No man should have survived that journey, yet somehow he had. Outside, the blizzard only grew stronger. The windows rattled beneath the force of the wind. Margaret glanced toward the darkness beyond the glass. You're not going anywhere tonight. Samuel looked relieved but tried not to show it. I don't want to be a burden. You won't be. She handed him another blanket. The guest room's at the end of the hallway. He stood slowly. Before disappearing down the hall, he turned back. I won't forget your kindness, Mrs. Hale. Margaret watched him disappear before returning to the fire. She told herself this was only temporary. The storm would pass. The roads would reopen. The stranger would continue west. By next week, Hale Creek Ranch would be quiet again. She believed that with complete certainty. Outside, the Wyoming blizzard buried the valley beneath fresh snow. Inside the old ranch house, fate had quietly arrived and taken the spare room. The blizzard held Hale Creek Ranch captive for 3 long days. Snow buried the fences until only the tops of the posts remained visible. The trail leading toward Red Pine Valley disappeared completely beneath towering drifts, and the wind continued to whistle through the pine trees like a warning that winter was far from finished. Samuel Brooks spent most of the first day asleep. His body had reached its limit after walking miles through the storm with an injured shoulder. Margaret checked on him every few hours, changing the bandages and making sure the fever she feared never arrived. By the second morning, she found him standing in the kitchen, one arm tucked inside a sling while the other carefully poured coffee into 2 tin cups. I hope you don't mind, he said. I figured I'd save you the trouble. Margaret looked at the steaming pot. You've found everything. I've worked in enough ranch kitchens. She accepted the cup with a quiet nod. Most guests waited to be served. Samuel simply noticed what needed doing. It was the first thing about him that surprised her. How's the shoulder? She asked. Sore. It should be. He smiled faintly. I'll survive. She believed him. The day passed peacefully. Margaret handled the outdoor chores while Samuel remained indoors, reading one of the old books stacked on the shelves beside the fireplace. He wasn't the kind of man who complained about resting. Neither was he comfortable doing nothing. Whenever she returned from the barn, she found another small task completed. The firewood had been organized. The muddy boots near the doorway had been cleaned. Broken cabinet hinges had somehow been repaired using scraps of leather. He never mentioned any of it. On the 3rd morning, the storm finally began losing its strength. The wind faded. The clouds slowly opened. Sunlight spilled across the valley for the first time in days. Margaret stepped onto the porch and took a long breath of icy air. The road should clear tomorrow, she said as Samuel joined her. I suppose that means it's time for me to move on. She nodded. I imagine so. Neither of them said anything afterward. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. It simply lingered between them. The next morning, Samuel packed the few belongings he carried in a weathered saddlebag. Margaret handed him a parcel wrapped in cloth. Biscuits. Salted beef. You didn't have to. I know. He smiled. Thank you for everything. She walked with him to the front gate. The morning was bright, but the snow still reached nearly to their knees. Samuel tipped his hat. "I hope life treats you kindly, Mrs. Hale. And you, Mr. Brooks?" He disappeared down the trail leading toward the canyon. Margaret watched until he vanished beyond the pines before returning to the house. The kitchen felt strangely quiet again. She told herself that was exactly how she preferred it. Nearly 2 hours later, a knock echoed against the door once more. She opened it to find Samuel standing there again. His expression told the story before he spoke. "My horse didn't make it." Margaret folded her arms. "The canyon?" He nodded. "I found him where he fell." "I'm sorry." "So am I." Without a horse, reaching the nearest town would take several days through deep snow. Buying another animal wasn't simple. Samuel removed his gloves. "I've got money waiting at the bank in Red Pine, but the bank's closed until the roads reopen." "How long?" "Maybe 2 weeks." Margaret considered the situation. The ranch had more work than one person could finish before spring. Several fences needed rebuilding. The old hay shed leaned badly. The western pasture gate refused to stay closed. She looked directly at him. "I could use another pair of hands." Samuel blinked. "You mean work?" "Temporary. I don't want charity." "I'm not offering charity." She met his eyes. "I'm offering wages." He remained silent for a moment. "I appreciate that. You'll earn every dollar." "I wouldn't have it any other way." Margaret stepped aside. "Then you'd better come back inside." A faint smile crossed Samuel's face. "I seem to have a habit of arriving at your door." "You do." The arrangement began the following morning. Although his shoulder still hadn't fully healed, Samuel tackled every task he could manage with one good arm. He repaired broken fence rails, stacked lumber beside the barn, cleared snow from the livestock pens, fed horses before Margaret even reached the stable. He never rushed. He simply worked steadily until the job was finished. Margaret noticed something else. He paid attention. If she explained a task once, she never had to repeat herself. Within days, he knew exactly how the ranch operated. By the second week, he anticipated problems before she mentioned them. One afternoon, she returned from checking the cattle and discovered him standing on the barn roof. "What are you doing?" she called. He pointed towards several loose shingles. "These won't survive another storm." "I was planning to fix those in spring. I figured winter might not wait." She couldn't argue with that. Later that evening, she found fresh stew simmering over the stove. Samuel looked slightly embarrassed. "I wasn't sure when you'd get back." "You cooked." "My mother taught me that hungry ranch hands don't work very well." Margaret tasted the stew. It wasn't fancy, but it was warm, hearty, and surprisingly good. "I've had worse," she admitted. Samuel laughed. "I'll take that as a compliment." It was, for the first time in years, supper wasn't eaten in complete silence. They spoke about horses, about weather, about books, about the strange places Samuel had traveled while searching for work across the Western Territories. Margaret found herself listening longer than she intended. When the meal ended, neither hurried away. Samuel picked up one of William Hale's old books about frontier surveying. Margaret opened her ranch ledger beside the fire. The room remained quiet, yet somehow the quiet had changed. It no longer felt empty. Outside, winter still ruled Wyoming. Inside Hale Creek Ranch, the stranger who was supposed to stay only a few days had quietly become part of its daily rhythm. Neither of them realized it yet, but the greatest change wasn't happening in the fences, the barn, or the snow-covered fields. It was happening in two guarded hearts that had begun, little by little, to make room for someone else. March arrived quietly, but winter refused to surrender its grip on Wyoming. The deep snow covering Hale Creek Ranch began melting during the day, only to freeze again after sunset. Mud replaced ice along the wagon trails, while swollen creeks carried melted snow down from the mountains. It was the kind of season that kept ranchers busier than ever. Samuel Brooks had now been living at Hale Creek Ranch for nearly 6 weeks. What had begun as a temporary arrangement no longer felt temporary. Every morning before sunrise, Margaret found him already outside feeding the horses. Every evening the day's work ended with the two of them sharing supper beside the fireplace. Neither spoke much. Neither needed to. The quiet between them had become comfortable instead of empty. Samuel knew where every tool belonged. He knew which horses were stubborn. He knew which fences always needed another repair after heavy winds. Without either of them realizing it, Hale Creek Ranch had slowly become his home. One crisp morning they worked together along the eastern pasture, where several fence posts had begun leaning after weeks of frozen ground. Margaret swung the heavy post driver with practiced strength. Samuel mixed fresh soil around the new cedar posts. "You've done this before," Margaret observed. Samuel smiled. "My father believed every boy should know how to build a fence before he learned how to ride." "He sounds like a practical man." "He was. And strict. The strictest man I've ever known." Margaret chuckled softly. "I imagine you gave him plenty to worry about." "I tried not to." "You failed. More than once." For the first time in years, laughter echoed across the empty pasture. It surprised them both. As Margaret lifted the post driver again, the frozen earth beneath her boots suddenly shifted. Her foot slipped sideways. The heavy iron tool twisted from her grip. She caught herself before falling, but a sharp pain shot through her right wrist. She closed her eyes for only a second. When she opened them again, she picked up the tool as though nothing had happened. Samuel hadn't seen. Or so she hoped. She continued working. By late afternoon, the final fence post stood firmly in place. Samuel walked toward her carrying a shovel over one shoulder. His eyes immediately dropped to her hand. "You're favoring your wrist." "I'm fine." "No." She looked away. "It's nothing." Samuel quietly held out his hand. "May I see it?" Margaret hesitated. She had spent 5 years refusing help from anyone. Accepting it felt strangely difficult. Finally, she placed her hand in his. Samuel examined the swollen wrist carefully. His movements were slow and gentle. "It's strained." "I know. You'll need to wrap it tonight." "I plan to." He continued, holding her hand a moment longer than necessary. Not because he forgot to let go, because neither of them seemed eager to end the moment. Margaret slowly withdrew her hand. The afternoon suddenly felt quieter than before. As they walked back toward the ranch house, Samuel spoke softly. "You once fixed my shoulder." She glanced at him. "I remember. Seems only fair I look after your wrist." She smiled without realizing it. "Perhaps it does." That evening, rain tapped gently against the windows as melting snow dripped from the roof. Margaret couldn't sleep. Her wrist throbbed, but it wasn't the pain keeping her awake. Something else had begun stirring inside her. Something she had spent years refusing to acknowledge. She rose from bed, wrapped a shawl around her shoulders, and wandered down the hallway carrying an oil lamp. She stopped before a door that had remained closed for years. Samuel noticed the faint light beneath the door as he stepped into the hallway for a drink of water. He didn't interrupt. He simply waited. Margaret rested one trembling hand against the doorknob. "I've never shown this room to anyone." Samuel remained silent. "I wasn't sure I ever would." Slowly, she opened the door. Dust floated through the lantern light. The room was small, simple, untouched. Near the window stood a handcrafted wooden cradle. Beside it rested a rocking chair covered with a white sheet. Everything looked exactly as it had 5 years earlier. Margaret walked inside. "I closed this room after William died." Samuel followed quietly, but stayed near the doorway. "My husband built that cradle himself." Her voice trembled. "He finished it just weeks before?" She stopped speaking. The words caught in her throat. For a long moment, only silence filled the room. Finally, she whispered, "I was expecting our first child." Samuel lowered his eyes. "The fever took William." She swallowed hard. "And before spring arrived, I lost the baby too." The confession hung in the room like a weight neither of them tried to lift. "I couldn't bear to come back in here." She gently touched the edge of the cradle. "I told everyone I'd moved on." A tear slipped down her cheek. "But I never really did." Samuel didn't offer empty comfort. He didn't say everything happened for a reason. He didn't tell her time healed all wounds. Instead, he quietly stepped beside her. His eyes rested on the cradle. One of the wooden runners beneath it had split with age. He ran his fingers gently across the crack. "I can fix this." Margaret looked at him. "It belonged to William." "I know. I never wanted anyone to touch it. I wouldn't change it." He met her eyes. "I'd only make sure it lasts." For several seconds, She simply stared at him. Then she nodded. All right. The next afternoon, Samuel carried the cradle into the workshop. He searched through old lumber stacked against the wall until he found cedar that matched the original wood. Hour after hour, he worked with careful hands. Not replacing, restoring. Late that evening, he returned the cradle to its room exactly where it had always stood. The broken runner was whole again, so perfectly repaired that the damage was almost impossible to find. Margaret stood quietly in the doorway. She ran her hand along the smooth wood. You treated it like it mattered. Samuel answered without looking up. It matters because it matters to you. She felt tears filling her eyes once more. Not tears of grief. Not entirely. Something different. Something lighter. The following morning, a rider from Red Pine Valley delivered the weekly mail. Among the letters waiting on the kitchen table was one addressed to Samuel Brooks. He recognized the handwriting immediately. The logging company in Oregon. His final offer. His final chance. Margaret noticed him staring at the unopened envelope. Neither of them spoke. Outside, the last patches of winter snow slowly disappeared beneath the warming Wyoming sun. Inside the ranch house, both understood that the next decision Samuel made would change far more than his own future. The envelope remained untouched on the kitchen table for nearly an hour. Margaret busied herself kneading bread while pretending not to notice it. Samuel sat beside the window, staring at the familiar handwriting from Oregon. The logging company had been patient long enough. Inside that letter was a future many men would envy, a steady salary, a foreman's position, and the promise of a fresh start. Everything he had been searching for before the Wyoming blizzard changed the direction of his life. Finally, he broke the seal. He read every word carefully. When he finished, he folded the letter once more and quietly slipped it back into the envelope. Margaret continued working without asking a single question. She had promised herself she wouldn't influence his decision. If he chose Oregon, she would wish him well. If he stayed, it had to be because he truly wanted to. Several long minutes passed before Samuel stood. He walked to the fireplace, lifted the poker, and stirred the glowing coals. Without another word, he placed the envelope into the fire. The paper curled almost instantly. Orange flames swallowed the ink until nothing remained except drifting gray ash. Margaret looked up in surprise. You didn't even answer them. Samuel smiled softly. I just did. She stared at the dying embers. What about the job? It was a good opportunity. They offered more money than I've ever earned. I'm sure they did. He stepped closer. But it wasn't the life I wanted anymore. Margaret searched his face. And what life do you want? Samuel looked around the old ranch house. At the worn wooden table. The books beside the fireplace. The windows overlooking the pastures. Then he met her eyes. This one. Neither of them spoke again. Some answers didn't need more words. Outside, winter finally loosened its grip. Within weeks, spring swept across Red Pine Valley. Snow disappeared from the hillsides. The creek beside Hale Creek Ranch rushed with cold mountain water. Fresh grass pushed through the dark earth, painting the valley with shades of green that had been hidden for months. The ranch seemed to wake from a long sleep. So did Margaret. Neighbors noticed the change almost immediately. She smiled more often. She laughed without catching herself. The sadness that had once followed her everywhere no longer seemed so heavy. It wasn't gone. It simply no longer carried all her weight. Samuel became more than a hired hand. Without ever discussing it, he became Margaret's partner in every sense of the word. He managed livestock while she handled the ranch accounts. Together, they repaired the old hay barn. They planted new apple trees beside the creek. They built a larger horse corral before summer arrived. Each completed project felt less like work and more like building a shared future. One warm evening in late June, they rode horseback to the highest ridge overlooking the ranch. Below them stretched hundreds of acres of waving grass, grazing cattle, and winding streams sparkling beneath the setting sun. Samuel removed his hat and looked across the valley. You've built something remarkable here. Margaret smiled. We built it. He shook his head. You kept it alive long before I arrived. She looked toward the distant mountains. I almost gave up after William died. But you didn't. No. I'm thankful for that. She glanced at him. So am I. Samuel reached into his coat pocket. For a moment, Margaret wondered if he had found another letter. Instead, he removed a small velvet pouch. Her heart skipped. I've never been good with speeches, he admitted. I've noticed. He laughed. I suppose that's true. Opening the pouch, he revealed a simple gold ring. I came here looking for work. You did. I found a home instead. Margaret felt tears gathering before he had even finished. I don't want to spend another season wondering what life might have been. He stepped closer. I want to spend every season beside you. He held out the ring. Margaret Hale, would you marry me? She covered her mouth with one trembling hand. For years she had believed happiness belonged to another lifetime. Now it stood before her asking for nothing except honesty. She nodded, then laughed through her tears. Yes. Samuel slipped the ring onto her finger. The evening breeze carried the scent of wildflowers across the hillside. Neither noticed the fading sunlight. They simply stood together, watching the ranch below, the place that had quietly brought two broken lives together. They married that September in the small white church at Red Pine Valley. Friends from neighboring ranches filled every wooden pew. Children scattered autumn leaves outside the entrance. Margaret wore a deep blue dress instead of white. It reminds me of the Wyoming sky, she explained. Samuel couldn't take his eyes off her. The ceremony itself was simple. No grand decorations. No expensive celebration. Just heartfelt promises spoken before the people who had watched their story unfold. When the minister declared them husband and wife, applause echoed through the little church. Outside, church bells rang across the valley. Years passed as good years often do, quietly. Hale Creek Ranch flourished. The apple trees they planted together grew tall enough to cast afternoon shade. The repaired barn stood stronger than ever. The fences no longer leaned. Every corner of the ranch reflected the care of two people who worked side by side. One crisp October evening several years later, Margaret and Samuel sat together on the porch, watching golden leaves drift across the pasture. The setting sun painted the mountains with shades of amber and crimson. Samuel reached for her hand. She smiled, still wearing the same gold ring. After a comfortable silence, she spoke softly. There was something I never told anyone. Samuel looked at her. I had chosen a name. She took a slow breath. For our son. He waited patiently. I never spoke it aloud because I thought it would hurt too much. She looked toward the old oak tree William had planted years before. I wanted to call him Benjamin. The name lingered gently in the autumn air. Samuel squeezed her hand. It's a good name. Margaret smiled through quiet tears. For the first time, it doesn't hurt to say it. It never belonged in silence. She rested her head against his shoulder. Behind them, inside the ranch house, the old wooden cradle still stood in its room. No longer hidden. No longer forgotten. Not as a reminder of loss, but as a reminder that love never truly disappears. It simply changes the people who carry it. Margaret once believed healing meant forgetting the past. She eventually learned something far more important. Healing meant carrying every memory forward without allowing sorrow to steal tomorrow. A fierce Wyoming blizzard had brought a wounded stranger to her doorstep on the darkest night of winter. She had opened her door because it was the right thing to do. Neither of them could have imagined that simple act of kindness would become the beginning of an entirely new life. And as another peaceful sunset settled over Hale Creek Ranch, Margaret knew one thing with absolute certainty. Sometimes, the coldest storms lead us exactly where we were always meant to be.